What's going on, guys? Welcome into the channel, and in today's video we're going to be covering the NFL numbering system. We're going to talk about the old numbering system and the current numbering system within the National Football League so that you guys know what to do with your numbers in franchise mode or whatever mode you guys are playing. You'll know what to give your players on your roster at each position so that you can conform to whichever numbering system you prefer. Before we jump into those, really quickly, I want to say thank you guys for getting me to 13,000 subscribers. Please hit that subscribe button if you have not already. Please leave a like on this video so that we can keep things rolling, and comment down below. That all really helps out the channel, and I really want to thank you guys that do that on a regular basis. In addition, my Patreon is down in the description below, so there's a link to that if you want to support the channel outside of YouTube. As I go through here, I'm going to compare and contrast the old numbering system to the current numbering system, and we're just going to go down position by position, starting off with the quarterback position. As we go through quarterbacks, you'll notice that most quarterbacks are wearing a single digit or a double digit. So 1 through 19 is essentially what quarterbacks are subject to be able to wear within the NFL. This has been the case, and with the current numbering system is still the case, that quarterbacks are only eligible to wear numbers 1 through 19. Next, we move on to running backs, where you will see most of them used to only wear 20s, 30s, and 40s. Typically speaking, for running backs, they would wear 20s or 30s, and 40s would be more reserved for those fullback type players. We'll talk about that in a moment, but there was also kind of a clear distinction here with running backs depending on the 20s and 30s. Typically in the past, you would see smaller, quicker, more agile running backs wearing the numbers like 20s. That would be somebody like a Christian McCaffrey. You would see a guy like him wearing a number in the 20s. This goes way back in the day. However, you would generally see bigger running backs like a Derrick Henry or a Nick Chubb, or players that are more powerful backs wearing 30s. That has kind of fallen by the wayside even before they changed to the new numbering system. These players are now eligible to wear numbers 1 through 19. In addition, running backs are also technically eligible right now to wear number 80 to 89. You can have a player like Cordarrelle that came into the league as a receiver and is now a pretty good running back, still wearing that number 84 at that running back position. Fullbacks are an interesting position because they kind of technically fall into the tight end role of the team, but they're really kind of like a mix between a running back and a tight end is kind of the simplest way that I can phrase it without going into too much detail. So they actually specifically, for the longest time, pretty much only wore 40s, and you actually see a lot of these guys wearing 40s, or you might see them wearing some of those numbers like heavier running backs that are in the 30s. Typically speaking, though, this is a position that you give a number in the 40s. Fullbacks are eligible to wear some of the same numbers that we talked about before, so they are eligible in the same category as running backs. They can, in today's game, wear 1 through 19, 20 to 29, 30 to 39, 40 to 49. They're actually eligible for 80 to 89. Wide receivers are, again, different from those positions that we've talked about. Back in the day, you pretty much saw wide receivers wear numbers 80 to 89. They are, however, now eligible to wear many different numbers. They are actually eligible to wear 1 through 19. They're also eligible to wear 20 through 39. They can wear all of those same numbers that running backs and quarterbacks are capable to wear now. So you will see players like Tyreek Hill wearing 10, 17. The shift here over time is that originally they really only wore 80s, and then they started to wear those double digits in the teens. So you'd see players wearing 10 or 17 and things like that, and that became way more common and was within the rules. So you'll be able to see a player like a Jamar Chase wearing a number 1, for example. This tends to be, I feel like, a little bit more common with receivers and running backs trying to wear these single digits now, because that's what they wore in college. In college, you see a lot of players wearing those single digits, even at other positions that aren't necessarily eligible here within the NFL, but wide receivers now are capable to wear the same things that I talked about with running backs. In fact, the specific rule change has changed it for wide receivers to make it eligible so that they can wear, the way it's phrased is 1 through 9 and 20 through 49. So they can actually technically wear a number in the 40s as well. It would be bizarre to see that. Typically, you're only only going to see wide receivers wearing numbers that are single digit, numbers that are in the teens, or numbers that are in the 80s. Tight ends we already talked about when we talked about fullbacks, but it's pretty much the same numbering system for there. They've pretty much always been the 80s, and if you can't give them an 80s number, you would give them a 40s number. However, they are also now eligible for the same thing that those other positions are, so they can wear 1 through 49 and 80 through 89. Then we go on to the offensive line with some pretty important distinctions in my personal opinion. I was a lineman. I coach linemen, so I kind of care about this because I also see a lot of people not stick to what the numbering system should be for offensive linemen. The numbering system for the offensive linemen was and still is anything in the 50s, 60s, or 70s. Now, that's not necessarily true to every single position. Typically speaking, your left tackle and your right tackle would be 70s, your right guard and left guard would be 60s, and your centers would be in the 50s. Now, that's not necessarily exactly how it plays out these days. You'll see a lot of players mixing numbers from position to position, and I get that, but typically speaking, that was the standard. 50s in the center, and then the numbers go up as you go out on the offensive line, so 60s at guard, 70s at tackle. You will still see most of the 70s at tackle. At guard, you will mostly see a mixture of 50s and 60s. There are quite a few 70s nowadays. And at center, you'll now actually mostly see 60s. So that has kind of changed in terms of what players will actually wear, but the rule hasn't changed. They can wear anything between 50 and 79, and all offensive linemen would therefore be eligible with a number in that system. On the defensive line, things get a little bit interesting because we have to kind of distinguish between defensive ends and edge players and outside linebackers. So I'm really just going to talk about more purely defensive linemen, more so interior guys, and then I'll talk about edge guys and whatnot from there. So typically speaking, on the defensive line, on the interior of the defensive line, you would see a player wearing a 90s number, and that's like first and foremost. If you can give an interior defensive lineman a number in the 90s, that's what they would wear. Then you would also be able to give that player a number in the 70s. And, sometimes you'll see a player actually wearing a number in the 50s or the 60s, but that's really not that common. So those are kind of backup numbers, but they can wear pretty much the same numbers as offensive linemen, except they can also wear numbers in the 90, and that is kind of their primary. And that is still what they're eligible for. There has not been a change here. A lot of defensive players want to have access to those individual numbers. You've heard probably a lot of outcry from certain guys that wore single digits here in college not being able to wear single digits right now. But then we also kind of get into the discussion of edge rushers, where you can see a guy like Brian Burns, for example, wearing a number in the 50s, and that's kind of their primary. So that's where we start to get into players that are kind of linebacker-esque edge type players, that there's a little bit of a gray area there, and the way they're defined in Madden is not the same way that they're defined in the NFL. Now, as far as it's classified right now, technically speaking, defensive linemen are eligible for those numbers that I talked about, but outside linebackers are not. So when we talk about edge players, there is still kind of a distinction here, where TJ Watt, for example, is listed as a 90s player. Max Crosby is a 90. You have Joey Bosa that's a 90. But then you have a guy like Matthew Judon who's wearing a single digit at number 9. Well, technically speaking, defensive linemen, as they are classified, are not eligible to wear any of those single digits, but linebackers now are. So you kind of have to group the outside linebackers in what would be a 3-4 system in with middle backers. All linebackers are technically eligible to wear these different numbers. And I can actually see that they kind of have a mistake in how they classify Von Miller. This is where you get into like this gray area, because technically defensive linemen are not eligible to wear numbers in the 40s right now based on the way that the rule is worded. However, Von Miller is listed as a defensive lineman here in Madden, but he's wearing a 40. So in real life, the way they probably got around that is, oh, he's an outside linebacker, edge type player, so he can wear a 40, for example. So that's where you get into those kind of weird gray areas. Nonetheless, moving on to linebackers, these players have been opened up in the rules. You'll now see these players being able to wear numbers that are in the teens, the single digits, all that type of stuff. But typically, even with your outside linebackers, you you would start to see numbers that are more D-line-esque. So your outside linebackers in a 3-4 system would be getting those 90s still because they're their premier pass rushers. They are playing on the line of scrimmage, so they're kind of a defensive lineman in that regard. But mostly, if you're talking about just a roaming linebacker, which would be your middle backers in a 3-4 system and all of your linebackers in a 4-3 system, you're looking at a number in the 50s. Most general linebackers that are, middle linebacker type players, roaming type linebackers, are going to have a number in the 50s, or used to have a number in the 50s. That's the way the system used to work. And if you couldn't give those players a number in the 50s, you would give those players a number in the 40s. However, now linebackers, as I said, are eligible for 1 through 9, 10 through 19. Those teens numbers, they're eligible for everything up through 49, up through 59. So you have all of those eligible numbers and the 90s. The only thing that they're not eligible for is the 60s and 70s, actually. Linebackers can wear pretty much any number within the league except for 60s and 70s now, which again are reserved for offensive linemen. At cornerback, the kind of general system has always been that these players are going to wear 20s and 30s. However, they are also and have always been pretty much eligible for numbers within the 40s. So they've pretty much always been eligible for 20 through 49. Typically, you wouldn't see players at this position wearing anything in the 40s. Typically, you would see most of these players wearing 20s and a handful of them, a bigger amount than certain other positions, wearing numbers in the 30s. Now they are eligible for 1 through 19. So keep in mind that you will see guys like Jalen Ramsey wearing number 5, Darius Slay wearing number 2, and then you have a player like William Jackson III who's wearing 17. Free safeties and strong safeties are actually classified in the exact same way. All defensive backs are technically eligible for 1 through 49, but that's not the way that it has always been. The typical norms here for these positions were different, and again, free safety and strong safety weren't eligible for single digits in teens at points in time. They are now. However, safeties, generally speaking, you would see free safeties wearing a number in the 30s, and you would see strong safeties wearing either a number in the 30s or a number in the 40s. A lot of times you would see the more run support type strong safeties wearing a number in the 40s. Think about a guy like Troy Polamalu that liked to come down into the box and play in the box, was kind of a quasi linebacker at times, so that type of a player would wear a number in the 40s. He wore number 43, for example. So typically you would see a player at free safety wearing a 30s, a player at strong safety wearing a 30s or a 40s, depending on what type of safety they are. That's no longer the case. As you'll see as we scroll through, you'll see some players, of course, wearing numbers in the 20s, which has always been the case, or you'll see some players now wearing numbers in the single digits, and they're eligible for numbers in the teens as well. And last, and actually least, we got punters and kickers, which are only eligible for numbers 1 through 19. Typically, I like to give these guys a single digit. Typically, they wear a single digit. Oftentimes, that's not necessarily possible, especially nowadays, and so you'll see certain guys wearing numbers in those teens. If I do want to give you any tip for numbering within Madden, outside of the offensive line stuff I talked about, which, if you don't get it right, in my opinion, can make your offensive line look really horrible, what I would say is make sure that you check your kickers and punters just a quick once over at the end of each season, or at the beginning of each season, because you end up with a lot of kickers and punters changing teams, rookie kickers and punters coming in, and the game will give them numbers in like the 20s and 30s, and it just looks really crappy. And so you might want to just try to check that over if you're going to check anything over in terms of numbers, because that will change year to year. So that'll be it for today's video. I do hope that this was helpful to you in some way. If you weren't familiar with the numbering system then versus now, what has changed, why has there been noise about it? And I know that I'm super late to this topic, but I think in terms of Madden, it's good to at least have this video as a reference in case anybody does care about the numbering system, whether you're creating a player, running a franchise, editing your players, whatever it might be. You might want your players to look good. As a famous man once said, look good, play good. So that's certainly something that I do believe in within Madden, and I always try to make sure that my numbers are at least correct on my team no matter what. Anyway, so that's been the numbering system as it was. as it is now, and some of the quirks for it, what players tend to wear, things like that. So like I said, hopefully it was helpful to you. If it was, leave all that feedback down below. Specifically, leave a like. And as always, I'll see you in the next video, and I hope you have a good one.